Some questions I see online frequently is it worth it to get a NAS rated drive for your home server? Should you get an enterprise drive? Are desktop drives okay to use? What about used drives? So in this video, I went out and purchased 4 different 8TB drives for the purpose of comparison. I'm going to run them through a variety of different tests, looks at the spec sheets, and see what might be a better option for your use case. My analysis in this video are going to be focused around kind of a home server and NAS type use case and workloads. But these numbers that I provide should be relevant for almost any different use case. I bought all of these drives for the purpose of this video, and there's been no manufacturer or external input. I would have loved to buy a larger sample size of these drives and potentially buy enough and use them long enough to get numbers for failure testing, but unfortunately don't have the resources, so I'm going to have to deal with the data I can get from the single drives I bought for the purpose of this video. But with that out of the way, let's take a look at the individual drives I bought. Here's all the drives summed up in a table, but let's go through all the drives one by one and why I picked them. The first drive I bought was a Seagate Barracuda 8TB drive. This drive was bought because it's the cheapest new drive that wasn't used or refurbished I could get on Amazon. It was about $130, aimed towards desktop workloads, and has a relatively low amount of workload rating in terms of terabytes per year and load and unload cycles that the drive can handle. It is also the only drive that is SMR and the only drive that's 5400 RPM out of all of these that I did some testing with. The next drive I took a look at was a Seagate Ironwolf drive. This drive is targeted towards a NAS use case, 7200 RPM, CMR, so it doesn't have any SMR issues. It's an air-filled drive with a 256 megabyte of internal cache on this drive. I bought it for about $180 on Amazon, and it's kind of one of the standard NAS rated drives you can get. The next drive I took a look at is kind of a enterprisey or the highest tier class of drive I could get, and in this case a WD Gold I bought to represent that. This drive I bought for $240. It was also an air-filled drive at 7200 RPM with a 256 megabyte cache. This drive has the longest warranty and the highest workload ratings out of the bunch, with a 5-year warranty and 550 terabytes a year of rated workload. The next drive I wanted to take a look at was a kind of used or refurbished, one of these cheaper drives I see out in the market. So I went on Amazon, searched for the drives, and bought the cheapest drive that had prime shipping that was 8 terabytes from what it seemed to be a moderately reputable seller. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of different variety in the used and refurbished market because these drives can come from many different places, but the drive I got was from a seller called Hard Drive Geeks, listed as used, and got it for about 70 bucks. The drive came quickly, was 8 terabytes, and turned out to be an HGST used server drive with roughly 50,000 hours on it, which is kind of 5 or 6 years of continuous on time, which is quite a bit for what I consider to be a hard drive's rated workload. It's also a helium-filled drive compared to the rest of the new drives I bought that were air-filled. I also compared 2 more hard drives I had laying around from my previous NAS use cases because I just want to see how some kind of these older drives work. Both of these drives were shucked from external WD Easy Store enclosures. One of these drives is what I called my shucked air drive, which was a air-filled drive, and the other one was my shucked helium drive, which is a helium-filled shucked drive. Taking a look at the table of all the different drives and their specs, a lot of these shucked drives just don't have good data sheets, so I wasn't able to get things like the workload rating or anything else. I also want to just give props to the used HDST drive because it has a full data sheet with a ton of different specifications on it compared to the relatively small amount of data that these newer like Ironwolf Gold and Barracuda drives gives you. The other thing is the used drive I got from the seller says they have a 5-year warranty, which puts it near the top, but also I don't want to trust that seller nearly as much as like WD or Seagate or Toshiba, the large manufacturers, as it seems like they might not honor it if they don't exist, and these sellers kind of come and go a lot more than the hard drive manufacturers, which have been here for decades at this point now. All of these hard drives are 3.5-inch hard drives with all the standard mounting screws as well as SATA connections on them. The one difference that one of my shuck drives has, it has the 3.3 volt shutdown, so it won't work in a standard desktop power supply unless you disable the 3.3 volt rail going to it. The rest of the drives worked just fine with any standard ordinary desktop power supply and was completely plug and play. Now let's take a look at the performance of the different drives I tested. For my performance testing, I used an AM4 test bench with an X570 Taichi motherboard using the onboard SATA ports and a 5950X CPU. These SATA ports should be more than enough speed to take advantage of all of these hard drives and appeared to be on par with all the other SATA controllers I've used in the past. For my software, I used Debian 12 Bookworm with and used FIO to get performance numbers under different situations in a repeatable manner. If you want to see how exactly I got these graphs and the exact raw data, take a look at the description below and I have all of the data linked there. The first workload I ran was a sequential read and sequential write of the whole drive. This graph here shows the performance of the drive as it degrades when you get farther into the drive, because the outer rings are larger on a hard drive than the inner rings of data. The first thing I noticed when looking at these graphs is that there's two clusters of drives. The Ironwolf and Gold drives, which were significantly faster than everything else, and the rest of the pack, which was kind of interesting because the rest of the pack of drives were quite a bit different internally. Some of those drives were 5400 RPM, whereas the rest were 7200 RPM. Half were air-filled drives and half were helium-filled drives, but they all turned out to be very similar in terms of their sequential performance. This shows that using the latest drive with the most dense platters will give you a bit more performance, but I don't think it makes sense to upgrade to a higher-end drive for that alone, for at least home NAS workloads. It's just not that big of an upgrade, and hard drives over the last few years have had relatively small performance increases. Taking a look at the random I/O, starting out with random read performance, which is a queued up 4K random read, all the drives were very similar, showing the poor random read performance on hard drives, and how if random I/O is important to you, you should probably try to get SSDs or at least SSD caching. Random writes had quite the large difference between the different types of drives. The Seagate Barracuda drive, being the only SMR drive potentially, was significantly worse than everything else, and the rest of the drives did quite a bit better. Perhaps this is due to how caching and the internal algorithm did the writes, because there could possibly be some optimizations by having the order of the writes changed to help optimize where it's being put on the platter and reduce the amount of movement and weighting of the disks and platter movement. And the last test I ran is what I call my SMR test workload. This was a 1 meg random write workload that I ran for an hour. All of the drives had effectively the same performance for the test except for the SMR drive. It has a CMR cache, but once filled, that performance tanks and shows abysmal performance compared to everything else out there. If your workload uses some tasks that does random writes like this, I'd say that you should make sure to stay away from SMR drives. I've tried using SMR drives in workloads like RAID rebuilds and Veeam backups enough in the past and seen these huge performance hits that I tend to stay far away from these drives, even if I'm just unsure about the exact workload, because I don't want to have any possibility of this performance hit affecting my workloads. But if you know you're not going to be doing random write workloads, which SMR drives significantly struggle with, this 5400 RPM drive shows pretty good performance on par with older 7200 RPM drives, likely due to the newer, denser platters these new drives have. Another aspect of the drives I took a look at was build quality. All of these drives feel fairly similar, but looking at the circuit boards of construction, there was a significant difference between 5 of my drives and the Seagate Barracuda or the desktop rated drive. The desktop rated drive had a significantly smaller circuit board on it, didn't have any foam between the circuit board and the case, and it had a few different components which I believe might be like the accelerometer not included. This seems to imply that the manufacturing marketing that these NAS and enterprise graded drives are heavy dutier drives that have a little bit more circuitry and stuff put into them to last longer potentially is true, and could lead to the idea that the Barracuda drive wouldn't last as long. And it does seem to show that when you are paying more for kind of an enterprise or NAS rated drive, you do seem to be getting a little bit more when it comes to the build quality of the drives. Another important aspect of hard drives is their power consumption, as this will lead directly to additional costs for the power they use, as well as additional heat being dumped into your room that you might have to potentially deal with. I set up 2 multimeters for 5 and 12 volt rails and measured the power consumption in different situations. The different situations I took a look at was spin up, so the initial highest power draw I saw, the idle power consumption of the drive spinning plugged into a system that could potentially access the data, a sequential read workload, a random read and write workload, both done via FIO, and then the amount of power the drive took when spun down. So I told the drive to spun down manually as if it was idle, and measured the amount of power it took spun down, plugged into an OS, ready to be spun up again if needed. Looking at all of these drives, the 5400 RPM drive and the helium-filled drives did significantly better than the air-filled 7200 RPM drives, showing helium has less resistance and it takes less power to spin a drive at 5400 RPM compared to 7200 RPM. I also took all this data and put it into one metric. I put weighting based off the different workloads and kind of an estimate for home server applications to get a single number for kind of power consumption for these different drives. I then took that power consumption number and put it into a cost metric based off the average US price cost, where you'd be seeing a few dollars in cost savings depending on exactly which drive you picked. While maybe $10 or $20 isn't a huge number on its own, when you add up it over multiple years, this gets to be a relatively large amount of power consumption, especially if you're in somewhere like California or Europe where they have very high power consumption numbers, making these differences larger. From this data, it looks like the simplest way to save a little bit of power on your hard drives is to get helium-filled drives if possible, and to get lower RPM drives like 5400 RPM drives if possible. One aspect of these drives I wasn't able to test correctly was the sound level they produced. Sound produced by hard drives can vary wildly depending on the surface it's placed on. If it's placed on a hard surface, the seat noises can be quite loud and dampening can help quite a bit. For the purpose of this video, I'm going to say all the hard drives were close enough to not be a major significant factor, and since I don't have a good testing methodology, I'm going to leave it there for noise level. One super important aspect of hard drives that is really hard to get good data for is the reliability of the drives. And unfortunately, I don't have the sample size and duration to test these drives to see which ones would be significantly more reliable than the other models. And unfortunately, there isn't good data that anyone else I've seen publicly has released either. The companies that likely have this data, the manufacturers, don't release it, and the closest we have is likely the Backblaze data, which I will give huge credits to making their data public, which almost no one else does who has a sample of drives that big. But they aren't using these exact drives I'm testing, and since they aren't using the same model of drives that I'm using in my testing, I don't want to extrapolate their experiences with drives of potentially the same manufacturer with the drives I'm using today, so I'm going to say that data is not relevant for these comparisons. With my drives I looked at, I was comparing some new drives to some used drives. And I want to say the used drive is probably going to be less reliable, as 50,000 hours is kind of my line for this drive that has probably seen most of its life used up. There's an argument that the drive being significantly cheaper means it's a better value in terms of dollars per hour left on the drive you can use, but that is something you have to take into account with the drives. The other way to look at the drives in terms of reliability is what the manufacturer states for these drives. And if you're looking at that number, the enterprise drives are going to be better. They have the longest warranty, with the WD Gold and equivalent drives having a 5-year warranty. They also typically have lower annual failure rate numbers. But I wouldn't trust the warranty alone as a representation of how long the drive is going to last. And a warranty will just give you a new drive of the same capacity. It will not give your data back. So make sure you do have backups of drives and are ready for them to fail. And while annual failure rate data might be important, the fact that none of the manufacturers list the full methodology for these things, and any data that makes me think that they ran full testing, makes me not want to look at it as a single aspect. So unfortunately for reliability, while the higher rated drives are likely going to be better, I can't say so for sure, but I think I can say with a good amount of confidence that a used drive probably has less hours you're going to get left on it on average. After I finished all the testing on my drives, the 8TB used drive I got on Amazon started showing some issues, as you can see here by this Crystal Disk Info screenshot. I sent an email to Hard Drive Geeks, the reseller of this drive, and they accepted it for an RMA, and as of the making of this video, it's been mailed off, but I haven't gotten the new drive back. I'll update the video description or add a pinned comment with the updated status if I get this drive back. But this doesn't change any of my thoughts about the reliability of these drives because it's a single drive example that I have. But I just wanted to add this experience I had with this drive to the rest of the video, and perhaps it is a single example of what can happen with these hard drive resellers when it comes to their return policy. Now that I've gone over the data I've collected and the different aspects of the drive and how I'm thinking about it, let's kind of get to my analysis and what drives would I buy/recommend. I'm going to start this off by getting rid of the drives that I wouldn't get. So the first one on that list is the Barracuda or any SMR drive. I see the SMR performance hit as huge, and even if I don't think my workload's going to suffer from the performance hit, there's a chance that it will, and I've been burned by SMR drives too much in the past to just buy one now knowing that it's an SMR drive. So I'm going to cross that one off my list. The next drive I'm going to cross off my list is the WD Gold drive. While I would say this is a better quality drive from the specs, performance and usage-wise appears to be very similar or identical to my Iron Wolf drive, making it seem like a pretty hard argument to get the gold over the Iron Wolf, seeing that it costs a good amount more for 2 more years of warranty and a slightly higher workload rating. I don't think I could justify myself spending that much extra money for a bit higher workload, and would think that if your goal is to keep failures down, it's probably better to just buy another Iron Wolf, slap it in your system as potentially adding another parity drive or a hot spare, than it is to depend on the warranty for that drive. But that's my thoughts, and those features could be more valuable. If the cost difference was smaller, I can see the argument for going with an enterprise drive being quite a bit larger. I do want to make a quick aside that I have seen some enterprise grade drives marketed from kind of potentially gray market sellers that might not get warranty. So if you're buying the drives for the warranty, double check if the warranty checkers on most of the hard drive manufacturers' websites to make sure you can actually use that warranty. This leaves me with 2 hard drives, the Iron Wolf and these used refurb drives. With the 2 drives I have left, setting cost aside, the Iron Wolf is almost certainly the better drive. It uses a little bit more power, which may be mitigated if you get larger capacity drives, but it's a bit faster, should have quite a few more hours left on it, and likely be less likely to fail, especially in the short term. But when taking a look at the cost, these used refurb drives are quite a bit cheaper, and even at nearly a third of the cost of the Iron Wolf drive, I'd guess I'd probably get at least a third of the remaining hours on these drives, meaning if I'm willing to deal with replacements, I'm probably getting a better value. But make sure you don't end up like I did in a previous video where I kind of had a cascading RAID failure and kind of forgot about it and didn't replace it nearly as fast as I should have. Maybe take the cheaper drives as an excuse to get another drive to set on top of the server or use as a hot spare, just in case it needs to get replaced later on, so it's harder for you to forget about it or fail to do it. But I think either of these drives has their applications, and really comes down to, are you willing to pay for the peace of mind and probably more reliable hard drives, the likely better warranty from the manufacturer versus a third-party seller, and a bit more performance, which newer drives will get you. Though I see the value proposition, and if I'm trying to save a buck, I could easily see me getting these used refurb drives, and personally have bought quite a few in the past that have worked well. Moving away from these 4 specific 8TB drives, I would typically be tempted to get larger drives if I can. Larger drives are going to force you into helium drives, which should be a bit more power efficient than some of the air-filled drives I saw here today, as well as having a lower amount of power consumption per terabyte, because the larger drives use about the same or a little bit more power while storing significantly more data. So I don't think 8TB typically makes sense, but that's what I chose for my testing here today. I also want to make an argument for a hypothetical drive that doesn't exist, a kind of power optimized drive, helium filled, 5400 RPM, that uses a bit less power but still having what I'd say is enough performance for kind of a home NAS use case. While drives have kind of been like this in the past with the WD green drives, those were done pre-helium and had very aggressive head parking, which led to high failure rates. And a new hard drive that's designed to be reliable, uses dense platters for good performance, as well as helium, might be an interesting drive to see that doesn't seem to exist, because all of these large helium-filled drives are 7200 RPM from what I can see. Hopefully this hard drive comparison video was interesting to you, and you got some cool data from the different graphs and power consumption numbers I got from these drives. Let me know in the comments below what drive you'd probably want to pick with, and how you decided what tier of drive to go with. But before I end this video, I'm going to go on a bit of a rant about SMR hard drives, because I think this video kind of brings it up. I think SMR drives and the way they have been done are nearly awful, and hard drive manufacturers have just really screwed it up. I think SMR drives have been snuck into a lot of product lines, especially the WD red lines, and just never told customers of huge performance implications. They don't really seem to have regretted it and complained about it. And now these drives are what I'd almost consider to be manufactured e-waste, because I can't think of a great use case for these drives. Taking a look at some possible use cases for these drives, they're too slow pretty much to be used as a boot drive these days, and if you want just a basic computer, a small SSD is a better option. For games drives, I kind of could see an argument, and it's mostly reads, but for a lot of these modern large games, you almost want an SSD, because you get a lot of texture pop in and just load in way too late if you're loading from a mechanical hard drive. taking a look at kind of like a NAS workload, the SMR stuff's going to come and bite you and kill your performance and stuff like rebuilds, especially when you need your data relatively quickly during the rebuild. Don't like that there. And for backup drives where a home user might want a large amount of storage often, I've seen these massive performance impacts using backup software like Veeam. Maybe some software is less susceptible to it, but I don't like it when my backups take 12 plus hours and run at like single-digit megabyte per second ranges. It's just unacceptably slow performance, even for incremental backups. And maybe they make sense for storing media and stuff on your computer. For media and TV shows, the industry has really been pushing streaming, and for people storing media at home, on like home servers, you might be running RAID where you don't want SMR anyways, and if you want more storage, once you get to 10 terabytes and beyond right now, you can't even get those drives as SMR. So where are people supposed to be using these drives? I hate how hard drive manufacturers have gotten this, and I just wanted to complain this out to the world because I think they've done this extremely poorly, and hopefully you guys think about too about those SMR drives. Thanks for watching.